Welcome to 20 Tactics with me, James The Loremaster Lammin, where you join us for another instalment in our 8-part series as we discuss the tactics for the 8 laws of battle magic from the core rulebook. Today, we're going to be discussing the law of beasts, and I'm going to begin by outlining how this video will be structured. Firstly, we'll give an overview of the law of beasts using our competitive rating system for laws of magic. This can be found on the rating system page on triplecrownwargaming.com and is the same system we use in our deep dive videos. Once you've established this, we'll discuss getting the most out of the law of beasts on your wizards. Finally, we'll look at each of the armies which have access to the law of beasts, covering maximising the law of magic within each faction. So let's start by getting that rating for the law of beasts. Now, at competitive events, you'll often find some Law of Beast wizards hanging around, particularly in that support caster role. The lore is themed around mastering Bird and Beast and the very spirits of nature itself. Now, on the tabletop, this translates to a group of spells that primarily buff or debuff hitting power, and the lore contains one of the best control spells in all of Warhammer as well. So, let's take a brief look at each of the 7 spells and get this law's competitive rating. Now, if you've not seen the system before, we'll give the law a score out of 24 based on the following 6 criteria: variety of spell types, power and frequency of the law attribute, average spell range, spell flexibility, average casting value, and the quality of the signature spell. So let's begin with the law attribute, Wild Heart. If a spell from the Law of Beasts targets one or more units of war beasts, cavalry, monstrous beasts, monstrous cavalry, chariots, monsters, swarms, or any unit from Warhammer Army's Beastmen, then the casting difficulty of the spell is reduced by 1. So the big positive is that the attribute can be triggered by almost every spell in the lore. Now, one of these we're going to discuss later, and it makes the spells easier to cast, as the total required is obviously 1 point less. The big shame, well, is that it reduces the total required by 1 and doesn't instead add an additional 1 to the total. This would be a lot better, as it would make the spells harder to dispel as well. But we are where we are. Now, the second issue is that the list of what the attribute actually works on is quite prescriptive. It sounds like a lot, but there's actually quite a lot of stuff that's common that's missed. Now, this makes it hard to maximise the impact of this lore attribute or make it meaningful all of the time. Now, we're going to take a look at this part a little bit more in the tactics section. So let's move on to the spells, and we're going to begin with the signature spell, Wissen's Wild Form. Now, this one is an augment that targets a friendly unit within 12 inches on a cast value of 10 plus, or a friendly unit within 24 inches on a cast value of 13 plus. The target gains +1 strength and toughness until the caster's next magic phase. Now, this is a great spell and is pretty much why you see so many level 1 and 2 wizards in games rocking the Law of Beasts. There are very few scenarios where this buff will not be of use. It's both offensive and defensive and can very often feel like a must dispel for your opponent. Plus, with multiple casters, well, you can spam this spell several times over onto the same target for a huge stat bump if you want, or onto multiple targets to increase the threat across the table. Its only drawback really is its casting value, which is a very sort of 3 dice to sort of reasonably expect to get this off for most low level wizards. On to spell 1 now, the Flock of Doom. One of only 2 damage spells in the lore, this is a magic missile with a range of 24 inches that inflicts 2d6 strength 2 hits on an enemy unit on a casting value of 5 plus. The range of this one can be increased to 48 inches, and if so, you need to throw an 8 plus instead. Now, this one has an extremely low cast value, however that is mirrored unfortunately by its extremely low strength of 2. Against toughness 4 armies, it feels terrible, and it isn't even particularly great chaff clearance against toughness 3 armies. That said, you can throw a cheeky 1 dice at this one, and Ultimately, the more dice you throw, the more chance you have of rolling above average and dropping a few wounds, and that's not bad for this basement cast value, so it's a throw some dice and see what you get spell. Spell number 2 is Pan's Impenetrable Pelt. An augment, this one has a range of 12 inches and can only be cast on the wizard or another friendly character. They gain +3 toughness for the duration of the spell, and it's cast on an 8+. Now you can choose to hit all friendly characters with this spell instead. The range remains at 12 inches, but the casting value is increased to 16+. So the spell's relatively short range means that to really get use from this, you're likely to have your wizard quite close to danger. Now the positive is that it can be used to ensure that the wizard casting it is hard to wound, and that is often the best use for this spell, if I'm honest. It can be great if you're planning on getting into some challenges as well, but overall it does feel a little underwhelming at times. On to our second and final damage spell now, and this one is the Amber Spear. Another 24-inch ranged magic missile. This one inflicts a single strength 6 hit with multiple wounds D3 on a cast value of 9+, or a single strength 10 hit with multiple wounds D6 on a casting value of 15+. The spear pierces ranks in the same way as a bolt thrower, and regardless of the strength value you've gone for, it ignores armor saves. Now this is a pretty spicy spell, and not just for the obvious damage potential of adding a bolt thrower or cannon hit to your army for a turn, but because if you think about the best target for this type of spell, the flank of enemy cavalry on the base value, or a large monster or a large chariot type unit on the boosted value, well, you're almost always going to benefit from the Wild Heart attribute on it as well. On to spell number 4 now, the Curse of Anrahir. Now this one is a hex, and has a range of 36 inches and is cast on a 10+. The target unit suffers -1 to all of its hit rolls and treats all terrain as dangerous terrain. Furthermore, the unit fails any dangerous terrain tests it has to make on a roll of a 1 or a 2, rather than the usual 1. Finally, you can boost the range of this spell to a whopping 72 inches. Now if you do that, the cast value is increased to 13+, a very moderate increase to double the spell's range. Now what is so important about this spell is that the main rulebook defines open ground as a terrain type, meaning that this spell turns it into dangerous terrain as well, which the unit, if they move, will fail the tests on rolls of 1s or a 2. That makes it probably the best control spell in all of Warhammer. Not to mention, -1 to hit is such a consistently good debuff. Just ask Demons of Nurgle. This is the best spell in the lore in my opinion. You love to see it. Spell number 5 is the Savage Beast of Horos. Now this one is cast on a 10+ and has a range of 12 inches. It is an augment spell that targets a friendly character. They release the beast within and gain +3 to both their strengths and attacks values. This is another spell you can boost to hit all characters within 12 inches instead, but it does go to a 20+ to cast then. Now that is a big jump, but for those character heavy Death Star type armies, the boosted version of this spell is outrageous, and even on a single character it hits like a freight train. This spell can turn even a humble wizard into a potent threat, and is almost always a must dispel if the target is in combat, and if the target has a ranged weapon, that is the strength of user, well, the spell can be a potent threat in the early turns as well. It's just strong. Last up is spell number 6, and that is the Transformation of Kadon. Now this is another augment spell which remains in play and can only be cast upon the wizard, and only if they are on foot. It's cast on a 16+, and the wizard is immediately transformed into one of the following: either a feral manticore, a black hydra, or a horned dragon, caster's choice. If they are in a unit, they can stay a part of it, leading to some somewhat awkward tabletop shapes sometimes, and whilst transformed, the wizard can no longer cast or channel. All of their magic or mundane equipment stops working, and any wounds they have suffered in either phase are carried over between the transformations. That's to say, if they've suffered wounds before they turn into the monster, the monster starts on the lost wounds, and if they take wounds as a monster and turn back, then the infantry character takes the wounds that it took as a monster. Now, you can boost the spell to turn into a mountain chimera or a great fire dragon instead if you want to, and in which case you need to throw a 20 plus. Okay, so this one is actually quite poor overall. The lore attribute cannot be triggered unless you're a beastman, which is why I said Wild Heart isn't on every spell, as you have to be on foot in this scenario. The remains in play means your opponent can just dispel it in their turn and then stab your wizard to death. The monster is still a character, so it can end up just fighting a unit champion, and this is the biggest cast value in the lore, guys, outside of boosting. Look, the monster is strong, but you put the wizard at an unnecessary risk, and if there isn't enough space to place the model, when it's turned into the monster, the spell is treated as having failed to cast anyway. Plus, you lose your main caster while they are the monster because you can't cast spells. So you're not going to want to hang around in that form for too long either. In practice, the drawbacks generally outweigh any damage offered by the transformed wizard. It's cool, but it's not competitive. A bit of a low point overall. So, we've seen the Lore of Beasts is a powerful combat lore, giving additional strength, toughness and attacks, and making units harder to hit. Its damage potential is a little all over the place, but its control threat is outstanding. So, let's get the rating score for this lore. It gets a 2 for variety of spell types, a 2 for the power and frequency of its lore attribute, a 4 for the average spell range, a 3 for the spell flexibility, a 3 for the average casting value, and a 2 for the quality of the signature spell, giving this lore a disappointing 16 out of 24. So we've had a look at the lore's rating. Now it's time that we take a look at getting the most out of the Lore of Beasts on your wizard. Now the rating showed us that whilst the Lore of Beasts has some great spells, it's got some real shortcomings as well. With this in mind, let's take a look now at the tactical tips you'll need to remember when using it in your games. Now this next section will be divided into 3 sort of definable parts. We'll have a look at some general tactics if you're using the Lore of Beasts, and then some specific considerations for the level of wizard that you have it on. So that's sort of maximising it on a level 4 wizard and then on a level 2 wizard. Now in general, there are some things you're going to want to do when using this lore. First and foremost is that due to its lack of variety in spell types, you can't just drop the Lore of Beasts into any builds as your main caster. You need to look seriously at your army construction when including this lore, especially if you're looking at this on your level 4 wizard. Ideally, you want to try and include some units that the Wild Heart attribute can be triggered by, which means Lore of Beasts works really well on cavalry heavy armies in particular, as your characters will also like to be mounted in that type of build. This does mean that you possibly lose the use of Transformation of Godon, but fortunately you have an excellent signature spell to fall back on in its place. There is a second part to this too. The Lore of Beasts is amazing at improving your army's damage output and protecting your characters, so having an army with lots of characters really leans into that. It allows you to maximise the use of Pan's Impenetrable Pelt, Wisson's Wildthorn and Savage Beasts of Horos through their damage dealing and preserving of victory points. Characters normally have ways of improving their hit rolls through items or special rules, and that works really nicely with the Lore of Beasts as the spells don't offer you that. In other words, the combination means you hit a lot with the characters and do devastating damage thanks to the Lore of Beasts spells, and we haven't mentioned the -1 to hit from Curse of Amra here and how incredible that is when combined with higher weapon skills, something again that characters bring more readily than units. The final thing to consider is wizard positioning. Whilst the Lore of Beasts has a fantastic average range, and its damage spells and the Curse of Amra here can do some great work from distance, its best augments, Savage Beasts and Wissons, are a lot shorter range, so you're going to need to consider the placement of your beast caster. The long range on the control and damage elements of the lore, however, make this a bit easier, as the wizard's placement for buffs is normally the only thing you need to worry about. Ensure that your key combat units or characters remain within 12 inches, if possible, to maximise the lore's effects, and you'll be fine. Now let's take a look at the difference in tactics between a Lord level wizard with the Lore of Beasts and a Hero level wizard, or a level 4 and a level 2. With a level 4 wizard, your first consideration should always be the acquisition of Curse of Amrahir. It's the best spell in the lore, and thanks to its range, makes the wizard an issue for your opponent from turn 1. Something which you really want to achieve with a level 4 wizard, because you've invested quite a lot of points in the model normally. The focus after this should be Savage Beasts of Horus. Now the reason for this is twofold. Firstly, as casting on the wizard helps them to be a real threat, but more importantly, because it's realistically the spell you'll most likely be looking to cast a boosted version of during your games. And as you need to roll a 20 plus, your level 4 is the best chance of making that casting value. The other spells you should be searching for on the level 4 should then be based on the wizard itself. Something like Pans is a great choice on an elf wizard, but perhaps less crucial on a slaughtermaster. And more importantly, you should also be looking strongly at what you're fighting. As is often the case with the laws that don't quite score the highest on the rating system, you can still gain a lot from them, but you need to do some of the work for it. It's also worth mentioning that the signature spell is probably an auto-take in every game as well, regardless of wizard level, which brings me nicely to the tactics for using level 2 wizards. Now, I'm going to start by saying I always go for a level 2 here. I don't like beasts on a level 1 because of the 10 plus to cast Wissons. Now, I mentioned briefly earlier how multiple casting with Wissons is another great use of the Lore of Beasts, and that is very much how I see level 2 wizards working out. 2 or 3, if the game is big enough, is probably my preferred use for them. You have multiple Wissons wild form, which will help you ensure you get it off at least once a turn, and hopefully on your best unit that can be game winning. If you get it off twice, it's absolutely brutal. Plus, you still have a second spell on each of those casters for a shot at Curse of Amrahir, Savage Beasts. I go on. I think overall that's an incredible use for the lore in competitive play. So I'm going to move on now to the final section of our video, where we're going to take a look at the tactics of using the Lore of Beasts with respect to specific armies that can take it. So I'll take a brief look at each of the armies with overall things to remember when using the Lore of Beasts with them. If you like, this section is more practical pointers for the tactics we've already discussed. High Elves. Lore of Beasts has a lot of potential on High Elves, as they can easily stick to the principles we outlined in the general tactics. Going for Silver Helms in core and mounting your characters in the famous Silver Helm bus works very well with the Lore of Beasts. The baked-in reroll failed to hit rolls from the Always Strikes First special rule amplifies the strength and attack boosting properties of Wisson's wild form and Savage Beasts of Horus, and the army's higher than average weapon skill across the board means that the -1 to hit from the Curse of Amrahir really punishes your opponents. Like all elite armies, High Elves want to control the space so they don't become overwhelmed, and the Curse of Amrahir does that so well. Drop in some Frost Hearts to further feel the benefit of increasing your toughness and to give you another unit that triggers the Wild Heart attribute, and you're looking really good. 2 level 2 wizards really sings for High Elves. Mount them so they can get into great positions and prioritise getting Curse of Amrahir and Savage Beasts of Horus as your spells. Speaking of Savage Beasts, the Reaver Bow has a strength value equal to the Bearer +1. So, in other words, it's strength 8 if you Savage Beast of Horus the bearer of the bow. Now, I'd look into including that in a Beast Magic heavy list. Check out the High Elf deep dive for more info on that as well. Ideally, you've got 2 Wisson's wild forms on those wizards to go with it as well. Fingers crossed it works out how you want. Dark Elves. Dark Elves don't have access to heavy cavalry in their core slot, and also don't have quite such stellar monster choices. However, they certainly have some excellent options for the Lore of Beasts. Doomfire Warlocks are a standout powerhouse with Wisson's wild form cast on them. They trigger the Wild Heart attribute and end up with 2 strength 5 poisoned attacks per model thanks to this spell, whilst maintaining their fast cavalry status as well. Stuff some Masters or Dreadlords into this unit, and suddenly you have an exceptionally fast moving threat which the Lore of Beasts can offer even more to, in the form of Pan's impenetrable pelt. Dark Elves can use a Sea Dragon Cloak to gain a 1+ armor save on the characters we just mentioned, and when they become toughness 6 thanks to Pan's, you're suddenly getting nowhere near killing them. I'd also probably put the Crown of Command in the unit as well, just for good measure. So your top priority spell with Dark Elves is the Savage Beast of Horus. Then I'd consider Pan's Impenetrable Pelt in this build to be a fantastic choice. Finally, and unsurprisingly, if you can get 2+ Wissen's Wild Forms in there, you have a Doomfire bust that will be a nightmare for your enemies. Wood Elves. I'm going to move on to Wood Elves now, and I'm going to be honest, the Lore of Beasts has some really unique elements for them, and that's where I'm going to start. The Sisters of the Thorn unit are a level 2 wizard that always knows the Curse of Amrahir spell. Now, we've talked about the power of this spell throughout this video, and how good it is at controlling enemies' movement in particular. And actually, controlling enemy movement is arguably more important to a competitive Wood Elf army than any other army in Warhammer. As a result, I think a unit of Sisters of the Thorn are pretty much 1+ in a competitive Wood Elf build, and most other armies would bite your arm off to have a guaranteed Curse of Amrahir available to them. If you can take 2 units of Sisters, you should probably consider it. It offers so much synergy with all of your shooting units. They shoot longer as the enemy is often reluctant to move, and it applies a -1 to hit modifier if they try to get into a shooting war with your troops. If you do decide to take a conventional Lore of Beast wizard, Amber Spear should also be high on your priority list, as it gives the army some much needed high strength ranged output, and Treekin particularly benefit from Wissen's Wild Form, as do Wild Riders, the latter being the more competitive choice of the two. Bretonia. Leaving the elves behind, I'm going to look at the armies of Bretonia now. Now, if we look at the core tactics section for the Lore of Beasts that we just discussed, then, well, it looks like I was just describing a Bretonian army. Their wizards can sit in the second rank of their lances of knights, keeping Wissen's, Pans and Savage Beasts in tight range of the combat threat. The army has a lot of units that trigger the Wild Heart attribute, as they have plenty of cavalry, and Bretonian armies often take lots of characters, as Paladins in particular are one of the most points effective units in the whole army book. All of this adds up to an army that really benefits from having 2 or more level 2 beast wizards in their ranks. If you're using the Triple Crown Wargaming GT pack, then your Bretonian units gain Devastating Charge as well. Now this really synergises with the Lore of Beasts, as you have even more attacks to boost the strength of. The generic advice will set you up on your way here, but I'd like to add the following few extra bits. I'd focus my Wissens on my Knights of the Realm, and this is because they have weapon skill 4, which helps them hit better, and are only a basic strength of 3, whereas the other Knights available to your army are either strength 4 base, or can get to strength 4 through the use of certain items. I also don't want you to be afraid to focus your Paladin's equipment on boosting hit rolls. The Sword of Striking and Sword of Swift Slaying are excellent choices for a Bretonian army that's going to take some Lore of Beast wizards. The Empire. I'm going to stick with the humans, and the story for the Empire is slightly different. Firstly, I think having warrior priests in your army is pretty crucial if you're going to include the Lore of Beasts. The hatred is so strong with the strength bonus from Wissen's Wild Form. I'd go further than this as well, and I'd include a Celestial Hurricanum also. The extra power dice that it provides will help you to get more spells off, that's more chances at Wissens in your blocks, and crucially the Hurricanum provides a +1 to hit modifier, which, unlike the warrior priest's hatred, also applies to Empire characters, helping you maximise the Savage Beast of Horus in your list as well. Now, I know I haven't mentioned Knights of the Inner Circle, but if I'm honest, they stand up quite well on their own without the buffs from Wissen's Wild Form. I'd still include some, but they wouldn't be the target of my spells. Thinking blocks of halberdiers with characters in should be your main focus, as I mentioned a moment ago. I'd place my wizard in a small detachment behind my blocks as well. This way they're close to buff my units without being in the front row of a combat fight. Without being in the front row of a close combat. Finally, I'd ensure I included some Demigryph Knights in my list. They gain strength 6 to go with their armour piercing attacks from Wissen's Wild Form, and they also trigger the Wild Heart attribute. You love to see it. Lizardmen. On to the Lizardmen. The Lore of Beasts is one of the few battle magic lores you can take on a Skink Priest, and this is crucial as, if I'm honest, I don't rate the lore on the Slam Mage Priest. It's just too great an opportunity cost. But on level 2 skinks, I think it's a really strong choice. You're likely to take Saurus Warriors and Temple Guard in your army, and both get an incredible buff from Wiston's Wild Form. Curse of Amrahir is also a great buff for these units, as neither of them have incredible weapon skill, so making the enemy -1 to hit them is a real winner. What is also tactically really great about the Lore of Beasts though, and Skink Priests in particular, is the Arcane Vassal special rule. As the Slam Mage Priest can cast spells through your Skink Priests, you often put them in advanced, or shall we say riskier positions, and the Lore of Beasts can offer two great support elements in this scenario. The first one is Pan's Impenetrable Pelt. The exposed skinks can increase their toughness to 5, making the priests really difficult to shift, and a huge tactical threat because of the Arcane Vassal. Similarly, those positions often mean that the Amber Spear can really hit a favourable facing on an enemy unit, which lets you get the most from this spell as well. This works even better in a list that includes Lord Croak, as the high strength of Amber Spear makes up for some of, Croak's spell's lack of strength, and the excessive use of Skink Priest in that list, gives you a great chance of pulling the combos off. So, I'd keep this on the Skinks, and I'd focus on Wiston's Wild Form on every Skink Priest without question. Then I'd be looking to get Curse of Amrahir and Amber Spear as my follow-up priorities. Ogre Kingdoms. The Duke is a huge fan of the Lore of Beasts on his level 4 Slaughtermaster, and without doubt the Ogres get a lot from it. First and foremost, a Lore of Beasts Ogre army wants some Mournfang cavalry. Not only does Wiston's make them strength 6 with impact hits and stomps, but it triggers the Lore attribute as well, and to be honest there's not a lot else in an Ogre Kingdoms army that does. The other element that works so well with the Lore of Beasts is a Gut Star. And if I was planning on running Lore of Beasts with my Ogres, that's what I'd be building. Like with other armies we've discussed, the abundance of characters in the Gut Star gets the most out of the Savage Beasts of Horus, and can find real mileage from Pan's Impenetrable Pelt as well, especially on the Butchers and Slaughtermasters, as they're also immune to poison. If the Gut Star has a real weakness, it's that it can be charged by multiple enemies and overwhelmed, and Curse of Amrahir really helps in this scenario, to not only control enemy movement, but also to make them hit you less regularly. So to summarise, the Lore of Beasts on level 4 can really bring a lot to the Ogre Kingdoms army, with the Savage Beasts of Horus and Curse of Amrahir being your priority spells, followed very closely by Wiston's Wild Form. Beastmen. Finally we are on to Beastmen. Now, the Wild Heart Lore attribute affects all Beastmen units, so you can add 1 to the Lore rating as a result of this realistically when using Beastmen armies with the Lore of Beasts. So you can add 1 to the Lore rating as a result of this realistically when using the Lore of Beasts on Beastmen. Furthermore, thanks to this fact, the only consideration for your augment targets is the raw output improvement available for targeting the unit. Now, Beastmen have an item called the Shard of the Herdstone, which gives a free power dice at the start of each friendly magic phase for every Beastman wizard within range of it. Now, I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. Suddenly, you have 3 or 4 low-level beast wizards, and it's terrifying. You have a large pool of dice, and you can spam as many Wiston's Wild Forms as possible, either on multiple units, or, where I've seen it really have the best results, just on a single unit. You can easily end up with strength 5, toughness 6 gore in that scenario, which with 2 hand weapons and primal fury gives you a unit that, opponents just can't bear, and they're core as well, so you have lots of them. Not to mention if you're using them in Marks of Chaos, Mark of Corn, give them additional attacks, Nurgle makes them harder to hit, it's just the combo goes on. Lore of Beasts on Beastmen is unsurprisingly a great choice, and plays quite uniquely as well. To conclude, I'm sure you can see the potential that the Lore of Beasts has to offer, and that it's 16 out of 24 doesn't mean you should dismiss it out of hand. As ever, please feel free to get in touch with us through our social media, or comment on the videos with your thoughts about the Lore of Beasts, and head back to the Night of the Realm mustering ground to check out all of our exclusive content. I'll see you next time on 20 Nil Tactics.
Remember to tag your friends and like, subscribe and share.
then head over to triplecrownwargaming.com and become a Knight of the Realm today.
What are you doing, mate?
You alright?
Do it for Warhammer!